I mean, this is really not for government. I'm not talking to the government when I'm presenting this. I'm talking to everybody else. I'm basically saying, look, we need to ignore government. They don't have rightful authority. They're a criminal organization. They need to be overthrown and replaced with this universal law based on this concept that everyone has right over only their self. Now, there's no way I would envisage selling that to government, but I suppose I'm trying to sell it to everybody else in the sense of saying, look, we need to ignore government. We need to stop asking them to make this illegal and that, because they don't have the authority anyway. Oh, I could never thought I'd see the day when the police would be, busting into someone's house because they've got more than 6 people in their house or whatever. And I'm like, well, I've seen the day when they bust into people's house because they think they've got cannabis in their house, which for me is no less disgusting and no less criminal on behalf of the police and the government.
Hello and welcome to California Gold. My name's Dominic Frisby and with me on the show today is Matthew Sands. Matthew, welcome to the show. Do you mind if I call you Matt?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Dominic.
Okay. And we shall start, Matt. Why don't we start with a quick overview of who you are, where you come from and how you ended up where you are?
My name is Matthew Sands. I run a project called the Nations of Sanity project, which is built on the assertion that the only way to create a truly free society with truly equal rights is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a universal peace agreement. And basically the idea behind that is to say that crime should be objectively defined by this basic moral principle rather than being defined by like ruling governments who just make arbitrary rules. That's like a representation of voluntarism, and that's how I identify as a voluntarist, which is basically anyone who kind of understands and accepts the concept of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle that comes from it. So, yeah.
And what is voluntarism? Can you define voluntarism? Is it what it says on the tin?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's quite simple. It's basically the idea that all interactions should be voluntary, and it's based on the concept of self-ownership, which is the idea that every person has right over only their own self and responsibility over only their own self. And if we accept that concept, then obviously it's a logical step from that if you have right over yourself and I have right over myself, then any interactions between us must be voluntary, because obviously I don't have right over you and you don't have right over me. So yeah, that's basically voluntarism.
And therefore, do you believe in 0% taxes?
Yes.
Very good. Now, because I've written a book about taxation called Daylight Robbery, and one of the things I say about taxation is you measure the freedom of a society by the degree to which it was taxed. And we think of taxes in terms of money. Taxes weren't always collected in money. Once upon a time, the serf gave half his working week to his lord and he kept the other half of his working week to him for himself, but there was no actual monetary transaction. Or your produce you would give your produce rather than actual cash. And tax is a system of control, and so the freest societies, total anarchies, would have 0% taxation, and any donations would be given on a voluntary basis. I'm sure you approve of that. Yeah. And in fact, in ancient Athens, taxes were voluntary. Really? It was expected, yeah. The only example I could find in history was a system called liturgy. It was expected of the rich that they should, build a warship or build a bridge or hold these games or whatever it was. But it was done on a voluntary basis. And the liturgist, not only did he have to pay for it, was he expected to pay for it, he would carry the work out himself and put his name on it. So it means that he was risking his own reputation and his own capital. So the project would, as a result, will be carried out to a higher standard than if, some bureaucrat with no skin in the game was doing the same.
Just using stolen money.
Yeah, exactly. So you have, 0% anarchy at one end of the scale, and then at the other end of the scale, you would have totalitarian North Korea or Soviet Russia or something, where you don't own any of your own labor. And the total extreme is slavery, where you don't own your labor, you don't own yourself. Yeah. And, a serf, for example, was if the Lord sold the land, then you got the serf free. and slavery and so on. And the social democracies in which we live in today are sort of, depending on where you are, but between about 40 and 60% tax, of GDP is tax. It's only June, for example, in the UK, that what you earn starts becoming yours to keep. So I use that taxation as a measure, as a measure thing. So I'm delighted. So now, tell me what the difference is between voluntarism and anarcho-capitalism. I understand there's a difference.
Well, yeah, there is, certainly to my mind. I mean, I think it's probably important to acknowledge that there's probably three working definitions of anarcho-capitalism. So I probably better give all three and then say which one
Sure.
I sort of believe in, because the way I conceptualize anarcho-capitalism is basically like voluntarism, but with a specified economic preference, i.e. free market capitalism, which might seem like a no-brainer because most people think, well, that's obvious. If you're going to have a free society, you're going to have free trade. But the only reason why I don't think the capitalism aspect is necessary, if you're just talking about voluntarism, is you don't need to emphasize that. For example, someone could have some kind of commune as long as it's voluntary, as long as no property rights are being violated. Now, most people wouldn't class that as capitalism, but I would certainly class it as voluntarism. So the way I envisage voluntarism and anarcho-capitalism is voluntarism is just a neutral kind of literally self-ownership, all interactions are voluntary, and that's voluntarism. Anarcho-capitalism is basically the same, but with that economic preference attached to it. Now, some people do define anarcho-capitalism differently. I had a debate a little while ago with David Friedman. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's the son of Milton.
Son.
Yeah. I had a debate with him.
Who's the last interview on the program?
Oh, excellent. Oh, well, I had a conversation with him a little while ago as well. I'll send it your way so you can have a look. But we had a kind of debate because his definition of anarcho-capitalism actually differed from mine. Both his and mine would differ from voluntarism, but his differed from voluntarism even more in regards to the fact that he views anarcho-capitalism to not actually be the same as voluntarism. In other words, he says anarcho-capitalism could exist as a voluntarist incarnation, but he said it could also exist in a coercive system. So he says, for example, things like drug laws and even slavery could, although he doesn't think they're very likely in an anarcho-capitalism system, he does think that they could exist within definition. And that's something I disagree with because I think that violates the anarcho. It probably violates the capitalism and the anarcho part, but certainly violates the anarcho part, which, dictates no rulers, which obviously would be violated if you've got slave owners, and certainly would be violated if there are drug laws imposed on you. So we had a little debate about there, but he's a very prominent anarcho-capitalist, so I'm not going to pretend that my definition of anarcho-capitalism is the definitive one. So I want to acknowledge that there are other definitions of anarcho-capitalism out there that that differ, but either one of them, even the one that's closest to voluntarism, which I would say is the one that I can't. There's a third one as well, which are people that insist that anarcho-capitalism and voluntarism are literally no different. And even when I give the example of the hypothetical voluntary commune, they say it's still capitalism because property rights are still being respected, and it still follows within their conceptualization of a free market society, that you could have a commune within that. So those are the kind of three definitions. One is that it is voluntarism. One is that it's, which is what I think the definition is, where it's voluntarism but with that economic preference attached. And then the third definition is the one that David Friedman purports, which is the one saying that it's actually really just capitalism without government. And even the voluntarism aspect isn't actually part of the definition, which I disagree with, but it is a train of thought that's out there.
Did you start out as a socialist?
No, I've never really had, I know it sounds silly, but I've never really had any kind of political affiliation. I've always kind of had a hatred for government from the start. I've probably been more left-leaning with regards to my sympathies early on in my life. If I looked at the left and the right wing, I always thought of the left being closer to my ideals. Although as I've gone older, I thought that less and less to be the case. But no, I've never been a socialist. I've never agreed with taxation. I've never agreed with, I've never agreed with any laws that the whole victim no victim no crime kind of ethos. And I've never agreed with the idea of us having kings and rulers and stuff like that. I mean, I didn't always have the non-aggression principle in my head, because these sort of terms and ideas come to me later in life. But and this is one of the reasons why I think this is something that, why it can appeal to a lot of people, is even if you've never heard of the non-aggression principle, when someone introduces it to you, it's something you already know. You know what I mean? It's just, you might not have heard that term, but the non-aggression principle was just a morality I learned at around the age of 5. It's not that different from that. It's just a more intellectualized version of putting it into a principle and, and thinking about all the implications.
And in a voluntarist society, how do you police it?
Well, you can police it because, as I say, I do believe you can have laws in a voluntary society, but they would have to only enforce the non-aggression principle. They'd have to be defensive only, and any organization that is enforcing the law would not be able to exercise any special rights or powers that any citizen, that any person doesn't have. I mean, basically, the way I say it is, because obviously my project is about making the non-aggression principle the law, and the way I kind of present it is to say, look, the idea of having the non-aggression principle as the law is that's the only law that could apply to everybody equally, and everyone would have equal right to enforce it. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to be equally capable. Obviously, a little old lady might not be able to fend off her mugger, but she would obviously have the right to use defense to defend herself or others. So it's important. So I think we can have organized law enforcements that enforce this one law, and that can happen. But the important thing is that there's no special powers or rights, because the beauty about the non-aggression principle is enforcing it doesn't require any power to rule over people or violate their rights. In fact, it specifically prohibits that. So yeah, that's how I envisage it.
And so let's say, somebody mugs an old lady. How is that person, who makes sure that person gets some kind of punishment for doing that, or how do we ensure that there is a sufficient deterrent to stop that person doing that?
Well, I mean, I do think that we need, I mean, the thing is, it's all very well to establish the non-aggression principles law, but it doesn't do much if no one's enforcing it. So obviously there needs to be diligence within our society. I personally, I mean, this isn't something that has to happen, because a lot of people kind of advocate for free market, private police and stuff like that. I don't think that's a very good way to go. I think we should still have a public serving law enforcement organization that's not just serving particular people, but it's just there to enforce the non-aggression principle as a law. So I think that we should have an organization kind of like a police, but as I say, not one that has any special powers or rights. Now the thing is, when someone violates the non-aggression principle,
who pays for that? Who pays for that?
Well, again, that would have to be done voluntarily. I mean, one of the things I do on the Nations of Sanity project is, because I obviously state that taxation is theft and we have to get rid of it, I also do point to ways in which we could have non-coercive alternatives to taxation. Although I like to point out, it's a little bit like the question of how would we pick cotton without the slaves kind of thing, and how do we build roads without government, and how do we pay for public services without taxation? The answer to that question doesn't change the morality. Obviously, the principle says those things are wrong and we shouldn't do it that way. But I also think it is important to show that there are alternative ways to do it. Just like, we can build a road without government coercion, just like we can enforce law without government coercion. We can also have voluntary collectives.
Can we enforce law without government coercion?
Yes, if it's the non-aggression principle. This is my point about the non-aggression principle being the law, because any other law other than the non-aggression principle, to enforce any other law, would require some kind of ruling authority over another person. For me to impose any kind of rule on you would involve some kind of authority, and for me to enforce it would obviously involve some kind of aggression. But if the rules I'm imposing or threatening force over are only the non-aggression principle, then by definition, it's only defensive force that I'm threatening. you see what I mean? So it's kind of like saying, if I said to you, I'm not going to let you smoke cannabis and I'm going to use force if you try to use cannabis, then you can quite rightly say that I'm violating your rights and I'm violating your freedom. But if I said I'm not going to let you rape and murder and I'm going to use force against you to stop you raping and murder, there's no claim of violation of rights that you can make. There's no claim of me violating your freedom. There's not even any claim of authority that I'm making over you, because I'm not saying that the force is a result of, of me having authority to use force against you. I'm saying the authority of the force is based on that principle of self-ownership, and the fact that the force being used to enforce the non-aggression principle would be by definition defensive, whereas the force that you're using to violate the non-aggression principle would obviously be the initiation force. It's making that difference between, like, not all force is equal. I mean, that's one thing as well. Sorry, I'm going on. But one thing I like to clarify to people when I talk about the non-aggression principle is so they don't confuse it with a pacifist principle, because it's not the same as pacifism. It's not saying no force. It's saying you're not allowed to initiate force against peaceful people because that violates their self-ownership, but you can still use force to defend yourself, and you can still use force to defend others. And that allowance allows you to enforce the non-aggression principle as law, because enforcing it as law is just defending yourself and others. Does that make sense?
Okay, so let's say Bill is accused of mugging Ethel. So we want to arrest Bill, but we can't prove that Bill mugged Ethel. We think he probably did, but Ethel says he did, but we're not sure because nobody else saw. How do we arrest Bill? How do we take Bill to court? Or how does that all work?
Well, I mean, the burden of proof is always going to be on the accuser, because, I mean, that innocent till proven guilty thing is something that would carry out in a voluntary society. Because if you think about it, you're allowed to use force on someone if they violate the non-aggression principle, because then it's defensive force and you're just using force to protect self-ownership. But if they're not violating the non-aggression principle and you use force against them, then you're violating you're violating the non-aggression principle and you're violating their self-ownership. So the point is the what's the word, the incentive, if you like, to not falsely accuse people and initiate force if you don't have good evidence that they've committed a crime, the whole innocent till proven guilty thing, is that if you take action against someone who you don't know to be guilty just because you think it or whatever, and you don't have you don't have sufficient evidence, then you are guilty of the violence against them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. How do you, so you have a country that runs on the non-aggression principle. Where does that country end? Does that country have a border? What if how does that work?
Well, morality-wise, it doesn't have a border, but then there's a difference between, I mean, for example, because someone said to me, okay, so like, say, for example, we've got some countries that are free societies, but then other countries are obviously still, statist societies. Are we allowed to wage war with them and stuff like that? I mean, obviously, there's issues with war, with the non-aggression principle, with all the innocent people involved and all the rest of it. But also, even from the point of view of, even if you could just take down the aggressive government, and the people that you've got a moral right to take down because they're aggressing, that doesn't mean you've got the ability to do that. So just because we might have the right to police beyond a certain border doesn't mean that it's going to be feasible or we're going to have the ability to do that. So if, for example, the United States of America became a free society and overthrew its government and replaced it with this non-aggression principle law, and within that geographical region that was well policed, but beyond that it wasn't, that doesn't, from a moral point of view, and this is the point of making this the law, by making crime defined objectively. So, a crime is a crime wherever you are, whether you're in a geographical region filled with people and a society that recognizes this or not is a different matter. So the limits of your jurisdiction really come down to, what you can reasonably enforce, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah, if you go to a nation that's full of slave owners and stuff, you have the right to take, if you had the ability to, to take down all those slave owners and free all those slaves, you would have the right. But if the whole nation is like that and you're the only person, you're not going to have much ability. So it's kind of like that's what, again, and sorry, this is why I insist that we need to create a free society where the non-aggression principle is recognized as law, because if you're not in a place where that is recognized on a societal level, you're not in a free society. You might be in a lawless one if there's no government, but that might that might be just as full of people wanting to violate your rights, even if they're kind of decentralized. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And how much chance do you think you've got of your principles having some kind of impact on government policy?
Somewhere around zero. I mean, this is really not for government. I'm not talking to the government when I'm presenting this. I'm talking to everybody else. I'm basically saying, look, we need to ignore government. They don't have rightful authority. They're a criminal organization. They need to be overthrown and replaced with this universal law based on this concept that everyone has right over only themselves. That's kind of my, now there's no way I would envisage selling that to government, but I suppose I'm trying to sell it to everybody else in the sense of saying, look, we need to ignore government. We need to stop asking them to make this illegal and that, because they don't have the authority anyway. This, it's like with the taxation thing. I do agree with 0% tax, but I also agree with 0% tax because there should be 0% government to administer that tax. Zero. And when I say government, I'm talking about a ruling authority, because one other thing I like to clarify is we can still have a voluntary collective that has many of the trappings of government when you talk about, collective infrastructure and all of that sort of stuff. But the thing that makes a ruling government is that coercive power, that the fact that they're a ruling authority. So, if the non-aggression principle is established as law, governments as ruling entities would be illegal, but they could continue as voluntary collectives that truly represent the people that want to be part of it. But as voluntary collectives, they'd have no power over people. The only people that would be part of that collective would be people that want to be. And no matter how many people decide how to do something on that collective, it's still only applies to people that want to be part of that collective. They have no power over anybody else. So because this is the important thing when we talk about like individualism versus collectivism, I sometimes think that language confuses people a bit, because we can still have collectives. It's not like we will have to be our own little island. We can still work together, but the point is we work together as self-owning individuals on a voluntary basis rather than being forced together as slave-like chattel under a ruling authority.
Have you ever looked at land value tax? Are you familiar with the idea? Okay, so this was a principle from it dates all the way back to a group of philosophers in the Enlightenment who were called the physiocrats, and they sort of separated between natural law and man-made law.
Okay.
But it was made popular in the late 1800s by an American economist called Henry George. And his idea was that the land is owned by everyone collectively. Nobody made the land, nature gave it to us. And therefore, and if you want exclusive rights to a plot of land, then you have to pay a rent to the community for that exclusive access. Anything you build on that land, if you build a fantastic farm or a factory or a house or whatever it is as a result of your endeavor. And so the wealth of that is yours, but the land itself was always there. And anything, and this is the same applies to the oil under the land or the air space around the land and so on. And as a result of Henry George's theories, one of the principles is that when we get housing booms, a lot of the time people make fortunes without ever having done anything. You happen to own a house that's near a station, and they improve the station and build a fantastic new line, and loads of public money goes into building that new line. And why should you benefit from that just because you happen to own a house there? It's the needs of the community that have pushed up the value of the land. And so if the value of that land and your house increases, not the value of the house, but the value of the land underneath, some of that value should be shared with the community. And Henry George's idea was that this land value tax, he used to call it the single tax, because it would replace all other taxes. There would be no VAT, no income tax, no fuel tax, nothing, just land value tax. And it's a totally transparent tax. It's not like inflation or something where they can, you know, take your money by the back door, or income tax where your money is deducted at source and you never actually receive the money. This is a transparent tax. The rental value of the land is agreed, and if a government is trying to levy taxes that are too high, the people who live on the land are going to go no and vote somebody else in. Right. And so it's a very so it holds government and people very much in a natural balance with each other. And the great example of the success of land value tax, Hong Kong was one country that employed land value tax in the second half of the 20th century, and taxation as a proportion of GDP never exceeded 14% of GDP in Hong Kong. So, you know, it's very low levels of tax, 10, 15%. But something like 40 to 45% of Hong Kong revenue, like ordinary people didn't pay income tax. Only the highest earners paid income tax. 40 to 45% of revenue came from land value tax. And, you know, Hong Kong is one of the economic success stories of the second half of the 20th century. And I just think you might find it's worth reading about. You might find they're called Georgists, but you might find the philosophy ties in very well with voluntarism.
Right. Okay. I tell you what, I mean, I can certainly see the logic in it. I mean, it's similar to my approach in some ways, but there's a little bit of a difference. I mean, when you said about the fact that no one, you know, created the land, it's no one's property, you know, on an exclusive level, I agree with that. But my only different twist on that is because of that, I say that it's no one's property rather than saying it belongs to everybody. I say it belongs to nobody. Because the only problem I foresee with what you're talking about is how is like if we say, oh, well, okay, well, this land belongs to everybody, but who is that everybody? Like how far and wide are we including the people who have an ownership claim over this land?
Well, you'd have to do it whatever the national borders are. Right. You might find this if I mean, you know, I don't think land value tax is ever going to be a realistic proposition. It will come in bastardized forms, and beware the bastardized form. Like the mansion tax is a bastardized form of land value tax, and it's evil because then it's just an additional tax. The point of the land value tax is it's the only tax. It replaces other taxes. It's not in addition.
Sorry,
but you would probably see that let's just say the UK. The UK is sort of naturally forms, with the exception of Ireland, the UK, because it's an island, sort of forms a natural nation. But with land value tax, it would probably fragment off. But if you take the UK, you know, some bit of farmland in Cornwall or something, or Aberdeenshire or whatever, is going to be worth very little. But, you know, prime city centre real estate in the middle of London, you're going to be paying a fortune in land value tax if you want exclusive rights to a plot of land in the middle of London. So it would equalize things out, but you might find that local, or the answer is whichever body is responsible for collecting that tax. So if it's the local council that collects it, then you would probably see defragmentation. But if it's a central body, that all the money goes to the central body, then that is your government. And that's who would collect the tax, and that was who would be the authority.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the way, because I mean, like I say, I certainly agree with the ethos that people can't really own land as it's not, you know, it's no one's individual property. But because of that, I kind of go with the idea that because of that, rather than saying it's everybody's to own as like, you know, like we all own it equally as property, I actually kind of say that land, natural resources, and other aspects of our natural environment are basically owned by no one. For the same reason, because no one made it and it's no one's individual property. And the way I kind of personally...
And who's responsible for it then?
Well, the way I personally envisaged it was, for you to occupy an area of land, you need to be occupying and using it with either yourself or your rightfully owned property. So, for example, if I build a house on some land, I don't own the land. Like I say, the land was there before me, and it's, you know, it's just part of our shared environment that we all have a right to use. But and again, you know, like with how we conduct ourselves and how we use our property under the non-aggression principle, the restriction on that is obviously that we don't violate others. So we can utilize the environment around us. It's, you know, it's for all of us to use. Now, I can build my house on a bit of land, and I own that house, because even though I didn't build the, you know, I don't own the land because that's not my property, but the house is. I built that. That is my rightfully owned property. So what I'm saying is, the land now, I am occupying and using that land because I've now occupied it with my rightfully owned property and my rightfully owned self. It's a little bit like, on a kind of more simplistic scale, it's a little bit like if you go for a picnic somewhere, you don't own the land that you've decided to have a picnic on, but while you're there, you have right over that area because you're using it for your picnic, and you do have your property on it, and you're occupying it and what have you. Building a house is kind of like a permanent version of the same thing. But the way I kind of view it in my mind is, at all times, the land just remains the land. It's just, you know, the land that we all share. No one owns it as property. So I would certainly object to these people that own these kind of acres and acres of forests and lakes and stuff like that, because there's no real kind of, there's nothing in property rights where I can see they can get a tangible rightful ownership claim over those things. But when you build property and you utilize it, or if you farm land or anything like that, if you're using an area, then it's still not your property, but you have a rightful dominion over it as if it was your property, while you're occupying and using it with either yourself or your rightfully owned property. So if you're having a picnic, then you're there, but when you leave the area, that land is back to somebody else can use it, because it's like, say, you didn't have rightful claim over it. But when you leave your house, which is actually your property, that's still your property, even if you're not there, even if you're not using it. And it's the same if I built my house on land, even when I leave, my property's still there. So it's still my area that I'm using to house my property. People can't use it. But if I could pull my house up, let's say it was a mobile home, and I decided to go off and settle down somewhere else, and I abandoned that land, again, that's back to other people to own. I don't feel like, so basically the way I view property ownership is I separate it from land ownership, because land ownership is mostly arbitrary, but we can still have dominion over land when it's attached to rightful property ownership. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go on.
No, go on. You go.
Well, no, I was just going to say, so the way I slightly differ with this Georgist view, even though I agree with them with the idea of, you know, no one has exclusive right to land because no one built it as their property, I think the logical progression from that is that it's nobody's property, and as a result, it's just part of our shared environment that we all have a right to utilize, but none of us have a right to like deny to others or claim exclusive property ownership over. But just like I can have a picnic in a field without owning that field, as long as I'm not violating other people in the process, or, you know, so there's like still restrictions on what I do. And like I say, I can build a house on an area of land. Again, if that's not interfering with anybody else, I can do that. And that doesn't mean I own the land, but while I'm there, it kind of serves the same as if I did own the land, because I own the property.
And just changing the subject now, let's talk about, Simon wanted us to talk about this. Simon, by the way, dear listener, is the brains behind this show, and I'm a hired hand to interview guests of Simon's choice. Simon is sitting somewhere in an armchair, stroking a white cat. But Simon wanted us to talk about lockdowns. So what are you thinking? How do lockdowns and viruses and pandemics work in a voluntarist society?
Well, I mean, it's kind of simple, which is that governments don't have a right to lock us down. And if people want to segregate and take precautions, that's their choice. But people that want to carry on and carry on as usual, that should also be their choice. And we shouldn't have, these laws infringing on our freedom. Because the thing is like lots of people have different views on the virus, but from my point of view, it doesn't matter how seriously you take the virus or what you think of it. The fact of the matter is the basic principle is the only person who has right over you is you. So, for example, people can request that I stay away from them, you know, if they want to wear masks and I'm not wearing a mask and what have you, and they want to segregate from people who they feel are being irresponsible, that's fine, because again, that's still within the realms of a voluntary relationship. But as soon as they start imposing laws and start forcing businesses to shut down and forcing people not to see their relatives and all of that, that's, you know, for me, that's blatant criminality. So I'm very much against the lockdowns. Not to say that I'm against people, you know, because some people mistake that for, oh, that, do you think that people shouldn't be allowed to, you know, people that want to wear masks, wear masks. People that want to isolate, isolate. But people that don't want to wear masks and don't want to isolate shouldn't have to do those things, in my view.
But what if by not wearing a mask, you get the virus and then you give it to somebody that's more vulnerable than you?
Well, again, people have the right to segregate from people that they feel are not taking the necessary precautions to protect themselves. So when you say, if I give it to someone vulnerable than me, is that somebody who wanted to segregate from people like myself? Or is that somebody who, knowing that I don't bother wearing masks and what have you, you know, let's put it this way, I have a vulnerable person in my life who we shouldn't visit. By law, we're not supposed to go and visit, but she wants us to visit them because she wants to take that risk. And my point is that's her right. If she would rather see her friends and family, even though she's in that classification of someone who's very vulnerable and it might be a risk to her with the virus, she has that right to take that risk because she's only risking herself. Now, I don't have the right. If she didn't want me to go around there, I wouldn't have the right to go around there and put her at undue risk. And I've got no problem with, like I say, any, like, you know, any shop that wants to have, like, you know, whatever restrictions they have with regards to how many people they let in and social distancing and all that, that's fine, again, because they're working within what they have the right to do. I mean, I know it seems like a very simplistic approach, and obviously life's not always that simple, but I do think it's, for me, the answer is always self-ownership. The answer is always the fact that you have right over you and I have right over me. So whatever the best thing to do is, because that's a separate question on what we should be forced to do. The only thing that we should be forced to do is not violate the non-aggression principle. Everything else should be negotiated. And if people want to say, well, okay, we think this is the way to go, we need to persuade each other peacefully. But if there are people that say, well, look, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want to social distance, I want to still see my friends and family, I want to still run my business, they should be allowed to do that. And if other parts of society want to segregate from them because of that, then that's their free choice. You know, it's kind of like, you know, everyone has the right to part ways if they want to, and on that basis we're more likely to work together because we're not being forced together. Whereas if we have the option of leaving, all right, we might part ways, but also we might actually take the trouble to negotiate terms that both sides of a particular divide are happy with.
So what if you're in a family, say one of those old-fashioned families where there's 3 or 4 generations under the same roof, and you've got granny or granddad who's very vulnerable, and then kids who are pretty unaffected, and then they pick up the virus at school and they bring it home? How do you resolve that?
Well, again, it's still the choice of the people involved. I mean, granny and granddad are consenting adults, and it's like, you know, I mean, I understand what you're saying. If they're in a situation where they might not have much choice because it's not their house, they're living with other people that are caring for them or what have you. I mean, I suppose you could argue that that's a little bit of a hostage situation if the people want to leave because they don't think their family are taking, you know, I mean, that's because, again, I just put it down to like any other situation where if you're putting someone at an undue risk that they don't want to be put at, they have the right to remove from that situation. You know, if you have someone living with you, whether it's you know, your parents or whatever, and you're their carer, and then they decide, because you're not taking the virus seriously, and but they feel like you should be, and they feel vulnerable, then they could say, well, okay, well, you're no longer providing me the care that I want. I no longer want to live. You know, this is the. But then again, you could say, well, maybe they.
Okay, so take the example of that family. There's nowhere else for granny and granddad to go. And it's a choice of either the kids don't go to school, or, you know, dad doesn't go to work or whatever and risk catching the virus. Everyone's got to lock down because granny and granddad are at risk, or everyone go out and do what they're going to do and we're even more at risk.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying is whatever they
do. Because at the moment, society, the way it works at the moment is society has been held, nobody can do anything because granny and granddad are at risk.
Yeah, and that's wrong. I mean, and my point is like, if you're in a situation where granny and granddad want the other members of the family to lock down, but they don't want to lock down, you know, this is a disagreement. But what I'm saying is these things need to be negotiated from the point of view that everyone has right over themselves. No one's allowed to enforce anything. So granny and granddad aren't allowed to force a way of life on the people, you know, their children or whoever it is that they're living with. They don't have the right to force that. But then again, the other people don't have a right to force it on them either. They both have a right to live their own lives. Unfortunately, they live in the same household, and that's just a kind of you know, that's just kind of a bad situation that they need to kind of resolve or get out of, because, you know, they're in that situation where they're living in, you know, you're living in, thing is, people can be living in an untenable situation without violating each other's rights. And that's an example of that. They're living in a situation where they're not happy with what, you know, their situation, and the other side are not happy with them. They think they should be taking more care. They should think that they should relax and let them get on with their lives. They've got that disagreement. That's an untenable situation, but both people have the right to have that disagreement. And, you know, it's like, that's a bad situation if those old people don't have anywhere else to go and they feel like their right to segregate is not something they can exercise because they've got no one else to look after them and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that's not a really shitty situation for them, but the fact of the matter is they don't have the right to impose things on other people. And this is the problem with this lockdown, the fact that we're all being forced to, you know, to lock down and stop our lives and shut down businesses and all the problems it's causing for the sake of, you know, like say, saving granny and granddad. I mean, one of the other points I made is like, when we first done the lockdown, when the virus thing first came out, I was more cautious than I am now because I didn't know much about it. And initially, my grandmother, who is the vulnerable person in our life, who I mentioned earlier, we didn't go and see her for a long time because, you know, we obviously didn't want to take that risk. And then eventually she was just like, I just want you to go see me. She'd you know, she wanted to take that risk. And my point was, she should have that right to take that risk. But all the time she didn't want us to see her, then we wouldn't have, you know, and we didn't have the right to sort of force that on her. But the other point about it is when she was isolating, it made no difference to her what the rest of the country was doing. You know, like if the rest of the country hadn't gone in lockdown and just people like her just isolated over that period of time. I mean, I've heard a lot of, I don't know, I'm not a scientist myself, but I've heard a lot of scientists said that we would have had a better go at herd immunity through the general population if it wasn't for a lot of these measures. Now, whether that's true or not, the fact of the matter is we never had the right to even try that because it's all being dictated to us from above. But my point is whether my grandmother wanted to stay safe and segregate herself, it didn't make any difference to her what everyone else was doing. We could have carried on as business as usual because she was still taking her precautions to segregate herself, get food delivered and not be in contact with people. And then when she decides, you know what, even as a vulnerable person, I want to take the risk because I'd rather have the human contact and see my family and you know, and all the rest of it, again, that should be her choice. The problem is when though this choice is taken away from us and the power is given to a ruling authority, whether they make the right decision or not, they usually don't, but whether they make the right decision or not, the fact of the matter is they don't have the right, you know, they're stepping beyond what they have the right to do. And that's my main issue with the lockdown. It's like, even if some of the things were a good idea and something that I could be persuaded to do on a non-coercive basis, the fact of the matter is I don't have, you know, it's not under a non-coercive basis, it's under a coercive system.
So what would you have done in if you were Boris Johnson?
Resigned, disbanded the government and established the non-aggression principle as the law. I mean, again, I personally think the best thing the nation should have done was to isolate vulnerable people and let everyone else carry on as usual and build up or try to build up a natural herd immunity. Because I mean, a lot of people are saying that people that have had the virus have got a better immunity than people that are going to get the vaccine anyway. So what they're trying to achieve with the vaccine, they may have achieved just by letting everyone get it, but isolating the vulnerable people during that period so that they don't get it and everyone else just gets it, builds up an immunity, and then the spreading kind of stops. So I think that would have been the best way to go. But my point is whether it was the best way to go or not, like even the locking down vulnerable people, people. That wouldn't have been mandated by law. That would have been, let's do this because this will be the best way to do it. But any vulnerable people that say, oh no, I want to take the risk, I want to see my grandchildren, they should be allowed to. That's my point. We shouldn't be stepping beyond and violating people's basic rights and freedom.
One of the observations I make in Daylight Robbery, which is that book about the past, present, and future of taxation, is that during times of peace, it's very hard for governments to impose new controls, new taxes, these kind of things. But in times of emergency, that's when they impose the new tax or the new law. So many of the taxes that we have today only came around because of some kind of crisis. You know, income tax.
The French War, wasn't it? The war with the French?
Yeah, well, it started in Napoleonic Wars, but World War I and World War II were the killers. And, you know, quantitative easing only came around because of the financial crisis. And the evidence is that after the crisis has passed, the taxation and controls never go back to the level they were at before the crisis began. And so over the course of time, you just get this increasingly large state. And are you concerned? Like, I don't think we ever go back to what we were before COVID. And I was not happy then in terms of, I thought government was too big then. I don't think we're ever going back. I think masks, for example, are just part of our lives now, hateful though they are. You know, I just find them antisocial. You can't make proper contact with somebody, eye contact with somebody when they've got a mask on, because you don't know if when they do that, they could be, are they squinting at me because they're being aggressive, or are they smiling at me? You don't know. Are you concerned that we have lost a lot of freedom as a result of this crisis and we will never get it back?
Yes, very. I mean, like you, I wasn't happy with the situation before this. And one of the things I think when people say, what happened to our freedoms and all this, I think, well, we didn't have a lot anyway. But yeah, I am concerned because the problem with this, and the reason why governments always do this sort of thing in a crisis of some kind, is because that's when they can get away with it, because they've got the fear on their side. And the problem is a lot of people, you know, are supportive of these sort of measures because of the fear. You know, they've bought into that, and they do buy along with that kind of party line that you're endangering others by not doing this thing, even though, as I say, if people want to really isolate themselves, they can do that, and what you do makes no difference to them. But you know, unfortunately, a lot of people. So yeah, I am concerned about it. I mean, funny enough, it's like my Nations of Sanity project, which is obviously, let's say, ambitious to say the least with regards to what it's proposing. And you know, people say, "Well, do you think that's actually going to happen?" I'm like, no, I don't. But I'm still kind of laying out what needs to happen, what I feel like our goal. You know, what the promised land looks like, and it's that, and what free society looks like. And it's one where the non-aggression principle is the only law. And I think, I do think that the problems that we have, none of the problems are new from the lockdown, but everything's been cranked up to like level 10. You know, it's like, you know, the authority that, you know, because a lot of people that said, oh, you know, I never thought I'd see the day when the police would be, you know, busting into someone's house because they've got more than 6 people in their house or whatever. And I'm like, well, I've seen the day when they bust into people's house because they think they've got cannabis in their house, which for me is no less disgusting and no less criminal on behalf of the police and the government. So from a certain point of view, I'm like, well, there's nothing new here, but things are getting amplified to the point that in the past, a lot of the kind of real oppressive aspects of government law fell on kind of minorities of people, you know, like, you know, the only people that are affected by the drug laws in an obvious way are people taking drugs or people that are, you know, involved in it in some kind of way. And other people, even though it does have bigger effects on society, other people don't necessarily see that, so they're not concerned with it. Whereas there's kind of a reason for hope, because more and more people are waking up to the criminality that is government. I think more and more people that perhaps didn't recognize what a criminal mess government was before are seeing it now. But the flip side of that is more and more people are cheering on the increased fascism because they're buying into the fear, they're buying into the propaganda. and they are supporting that. And it's getting to the point where I feel like society might even divide, you know. We might even have people saying, well, okay, we've got to pick a side. You're either for this fascist increase of government power, or you're for freedom, and you can't really sit in the middle anymore because things are going one way or the other.
And where do you go if you're for freedom?
Straight to the Nations of Sanity project. www.
But it only exists in your head. And it doesn't, by that I mean it doesn't exist in the, you know, there's no, the problem is, you know, the majority, I don't know if these polls are true, because polls can be rigged. You know, if you've watched that episode of Yes Minister, you can see how they rig polls with leading questions. But, you know, all the polls show the majority are in favour of lockdown, quite overwhelmingly so. And you wonder, but, you know, even if it's, you know, I think it's only 40% of the country actually voted Tory, or 42%, something like that. And so, you know, more people didn't vote for them than did vote for them.
Yeah, I mean, the largest majority
what we
is usually
got. So the problem is you can't go anywhere else.
Well, no, I mean, this
you know,
is
you say the country divided. I mean, we divided over Brexit. And where did the people who were on the other side of the argument, you know, where did the Remainers? They got no choice but to remain.
But this is, I mean, but this is a good selling point for the Nations of Sanity idea for me, because I can speak to somebody on the side of Brexit and I can speak to somebody on the side of Remain and have the same conversation with them about the fact that, look, if we lived in a free society, let's say we had a Brexit kind of situation in a free society. Now, obviously, this wouldn't be like EU and the UK government as ruling government, but let's say they were vying to control the regulated market. So people were voting in this country whether we want our regulated market to be controlled by Brussels in the EU or through Westminster in the UK. Now, in a free society, people can have that vote of, so, okay, as together, we all want to do this. But if we don't come to agreement and we're split the way we're split, then what's wrong with splitting that way? What's wrong with having a society where Tesco's have a little badge on their door saying they're EU regulated, and Sainsbury's have a little badge on their store saying they're UK regulated, and people that love Brexit go shop at Sainsbury's, and people that love the EU go shop at the EU. And again, it's just people's choice. You know, if you're that hard and fast into wanting to support the EU as a regulating system, then you only shop in shops that are part of that system, and all the companies and businesses that don't want anything to do with it, they can be regulated through the UK. And also the other option for a free market, for a free society, is that they can also choose to not be regulated at all through either, or through an alternative regulating body. That's the beauty of a free society. So that's kind of how I would approach a lot of these aspects. I think the reason why these divides are so vicious is because of the coercion that's attached to it, because the people that win with the Brexit thing impose that on the losing side. When the left wing get their way and their political party, they're going to impose shit on the right, and vice versa. And this is why people hate each other so much, because we live in a coercive system where whoever's got control or any kind of level of influence over the ruling authority can use that ruling authority to impose on the other. In a free society, no such power would exist. So in the kind of Brexit scenario, for one thing, you're more likely to negotiate a proper agreement where you don't have to divide, because you've got the option of dividing if you can't come to that agreement. So, you know, you can always negotiate better terms when there's not a gun pointed to your head. But the other thing is if you can't come to an agreement and you do decide to divide, there's no reason why you can't do that peacefully. Like I say, there's no reason why I can't go down to the local high street and see some shops are EU regulated and some shops are UK regulated, and I decide which one I want to shop in, perhaps for my political reasons, or perhaps I don't care and I just shop in whatever. But you know what I mean? It should be up to people.
If only, Matt. If only.
I mean, I will admit, look, I mean, one of the things about this is I'm presenting how it should be and how I think, you know, how the law should work and it would be consistent, and how this could work and it would be consistent. I do understand that we live in a society that's a million miles away from this, and this might seem like the most unrealistic pipe dream to actually propose this as something that we can actually achieve. And all the time, it's just an idea in my head. It's not going to be anything more than that. But I suppose I'm trying to push this out into a larger conversation so it gets into more people's head. And, everything starts off in someone's head, and blossoms from there. And I suppose my kind of, for all the things that are against the Nations of Sanity, the one thing that's for it is I think it can appeal to a hell of a lot of people. I just need to have a one-on-one conversation of about 2 to 3 hours with every member of the human race in the planet, and I think we'll get a more than 50% support.
Well, do more podcasts, and you can get to more people with one conversation.
Exactly.
Find the right answer, recognize you won't ever see it in your lifetime, and then advocate it anyway because it's the right answer.
Exactly. I couldn't have said that better myself.
So, what happens to the UK over the next 5 years? What's your outlook? Where are you based, by the way? In London?
No, I live in Chichester, which is like south of London, near the coast. I don't know, but it does nothing. It's all bleak. It's all very bleak. I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know what's going to happen going forward. I mean, one of the reasons why I kind of push this so much is I feel like we're so urgently heading in very wrong directions. There's so many small business. I mean, they're going to they're on the way things are going at the moment. If things carry on in this direction, we're going to have a massive dependent class dependent on the government, because they're ruining so many small businesses at the moment. I don't know. I know one small business that's doing really well because they're a local farm shop and they've never been so busy because they're just delivering food and all the rest of it. Every other small business owner I know, and even larger businesses, are struggling. I mean, the company I work at is struggling, and they supply food to supermarkets, so they're like, they shouldn't really be struggling, but they're being affected by various aspects of it as well. There's such a knock-on effect with everything. Even companies that don't have, it's like, I know people that own small businesses where they're allowed to stay open, but their businesses is in the toilet because of all the other things that aren't open that, what I mean? Like takeaways and stuff are doing quite well now. But I mean, I know a guy who owns a local kebab shop near me, and he's obviously forced to shut at 10 o'clock. Now, I know anyone who knows anything about running a kebab shop knows that they do most of their business after 10 o'clock. And obviously with the shutting of pubs, that affects them even more, because obviously all the people chucking out of the pubs, that must be 90% of their trade. Now, obviously they're making up for that as best they can by doing takeaways and, and getting into the whole delivering food aspect of it. People are trying to adapt the best they can, but they're just about keeping their head above water on a sinking ship, and it's depressing to see, and it's looking pretty bleak if things keep going this direction. And it's almost like the government are trying to just ruin everybody, so more and more people are dependent on them, and you're less likely to get revolt from people that are dependent on you.
Are you optimistic about technology? Because so much of technology, I'm talking specifically about the internet, so much of it is new. It's unregulated. It's a wild west. Is that the freedom frontier that will save us?
Possibly. I mean, we do still have the problem of, the powers that be have a control over it. I mean, we know, there's obviously been a lot of talk about the control over like social media and things being censored and what have you and stuff like that. But yeah, I do think, I mean, let's put it this way. For all the problems the internet has, the one thing it has done without doubt is connect so many people that wouldn't otherwise be connected. I mean, it's like me with my Nations of Sanity project. I've got the potential. I mean, I don't have that reach because I'm not reaching those people, but potentially I could reach everybody, I could reach anybody. Whereas before the internet came along, I was restricted to really just reaching people within a certain geographical region, and maybe if I, like our ability to kind of communicate and spread information is so much better. So there are reasons for hope, but there's also a lot of reasons to be bleak. It kind of depends what mood I get up into. And there's sometimes I'm feeling quite hopeful. We can kind of, there's reasons to be hopeful. And technology is certainly one of them, because, having conversations like this is something that we can do because of the technology, and as the technology increases, but then there's other aspects of the technology that I think are potentially making us worse, and and people getting locked into their kind of isolation, into their like more isolated lives as well. So it's a double-edged sword, and I suppose the way I look at the future, particularly the next 5 years, is it can kind of go a lot of different ways, and I don't know which. A lot of them are bad, not many of them are good, and the good ones seem the less likely. But like you said, with, I forgot how you said it now, but the whole idea of identifying what's right and fighting for it, whatever, I think we just got to do that, not with the expectation that we're definitely going to lose. You've got to have hope that there's a chance, because it's like, if you buy a lottery ticket, you're probably not going to win, but you still want to win. You still bought that lottery ticket to win, and you're not going to win the lottery ticket if you don't buy you're not going to win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket at all. And I suppose that's kind of, I think that's kind of what we've got to do. I think we've got to do what we can, which is kind of like buying the lottery tickets that we can, and hope that one of the avenues, I mean, I do think it's good that we're having these sort of conversations, and talk about freedom and rights is kind of increasing, but like I say, it is countered by the increasing support for fascism and government and control and all the rest of it. So like I say, it depends what side of bed I get up as to how hopeful or pessimistic I
am. Do you know what the greatest voluntarist movement, certainly in recent years, but possibly in all history, is?
Go on.
Bitcoin.
Yeah.
You've got this incredible new technology. Nobody has coerced any. I mean, a few people have. Nobody's forced anyone to invest in it. People have done so on a voluntary basis. It's united loads of different people around the world. It's grown and grown and grown. Every single person, by investing in it, is contributing to it. Every business that's built up around the edge of it is contributing to it. Every bit of money that goes into it strengthens the computer power, and it grows and grows and grows. And it is a voluntarist cooperative. Yeah. It's one of the greatest examples of the power of the collective you will ever see. And who knows, one day it might replace the existing global monetary system. And if it does, we will have a voluntarist system of money.
Well, I mean, that's a good example of where technology does give us hope, because there are, because the other thing as well is when you demonstrate how it can be done, that makes it even more, that makes it even easier to kind of get people to jump on board. It's one thing to talk about these things in an abstract way, like I am with the whole making the non-aggression principle the law thing, and get people to imagine what that would be like. But people don't need to imagine what it's like to have a decentralized currency, because, as you say, we've already got that with Bitcoin. So yeah, that's a good example of where there is reason for hope, and that is something that is working for us in that regards.
Good stuff. Well, Matthew Sands, if people want to find out more about you and about your projects, how do they do that?
Just search Nations of Sanity Project. I've got a website, which is nationsofsanity.com. I've got a YouTube channel, which is also called Nations of Sanity, and a Facebook page by the same name as well. So if you just type Nations of Sanity in Google, you'll find me pretty easily. And yeah, I've got some videos on my YouTube channel, conversations and stuff. I believe in this idea. As you say, as unlikely as it is, I believe it's the right idea and worth fighting for. So I do ask people to come along, consider the idea, scrutinize it. Don't just nod along and agree. I want people to, people that disagree, to come in and say, "Oh, what about this and what about that?" Because that helps me develop it. Join the conversation, I guess. Is that what I'm trying to say? Is because I think it's important that this is pushed into the conversation, and people start considering what self-ownership really means.
Great stuff. Well, Matt Sands, thank you very much. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Dominic.